Tom Nelson here with some history on the bass drum as a part of the drum set and foot technique and the evolution of it all. I think it's important that you understand some key points in history because it is those key points that drive the evolution of the bass drum within the drum set as its own instrument and also the techniques used for playing the bass drum. So I'll give you as quick as I can, but I apologize if it's a little long, but it should be worth it because you should learn a few things that'll help you understand the techniques, when and how to use them and apply them. So let's go back to 1910 when it all started. And it actually started before then. It was kind of building up to a point where when you went to see a live band in 1900, let's say, you were going to see an orchestra or a wind band or a concert band or a military band. There were no electronic instruments back then. So you went to see music live. You didn't have recordings. You had to go see it live. You saw larger bands playing music in halls. And the average size hall back then might have been 1,500 people. Some halls might have reached 3,000 people, and smaller halls could have held 100 to 200 people. In fact, many of those halls are still around today. Many of them have been renovated and are running concerts and musicals and plays and such, even today. And there's some beautiful old theaters and opera houses around the country that I've been in, and I recommend you check them out. They're great fun to play in. But there were no arenas back then. There was no stadiums, nothing like that. So music was live, it was acoustic, and it was in a smaller venue is where people would see music. And the music called for three percussionists: a bass drummer, played with a mallet, with the hand, a crash cymbal player, and a snare drummer. And as we got towards 1910, for some reason, I always like to tell people, probably money, because that's usually what drives downsizing, right? They decided to downsize the drum section. Somebody figured out how to play the bass drum with their foot. They invented the pedal. And I think the patent might go back to 1909, but I think it was around 1910 that it was actually available. And the pedal allowed one guy, instead of two, to play the bass drum with his foot and the snare drum with his hands. So we needed a cymbal player and then one person on the bass and the snare. So we dropped from 3 people to 2 people. Not too long after, by 1920, they figured out how to do the crash cymbals in the hi-hat stand. Same thing, they put those cymbals on top of each other, worked it with the other foot that was doing nothing, and managed to go from 2 guys to 1 guy. So now we have 1 guy doing the job of 3 guys. Keep in mind, back then the music was very simple. The bass drum and cymbals mostly played a steady beat in music. Boom, 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 boom. And the cymbals doubled that. Boom, boom, boosh, 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 or every other beat. So it wasn't hard for a drummer to play with both feet and the hands on the snare. And thus it begins. The drum set is born. Out of that, we start adding to that little setup of a bass drum, snare, and hi-hat. We start adding tambourine and triangle and wood blocks and extra tom-toms and sound effects. And music kind of explodes from there. We start getting smaller performing groups. And by 1935, the drum set is evolving and swing music happens in 1935. And that's the next big date on my history timeline. Significant time because swing music featured a drum set player with a 4-piece drum set usually. A kick, a snare, a rack tom, a floor time, a ride, a hi-hat, and maybe a crash cymbal. And that became the norm, and it was the driving force for the swing era. Now keep in mind, swing music was dance music. That was a dance era. It was an era of time where we went from concerts and shifted towards dance and socialization and cultural things where people were getting together and having a good time. And the drummer's role in a swing band was to keep time. That was his job. Keep steady time for the band. Now, because it was 1935, still no electronic instruments, still in smaller rooms, still with wind bands, the drummer didn't need to play loud at all. And drummers played very light back then. They played soft. They had to. And because of that, they played on a bass drum pedal, with what's known as the flat-footed or heel-down technique. Let me show you that with a shoe here. They put their heel down on the pedal and they laid their whole foot on the pedal board, and that's how they played the bass drum, very lightly. They didn't need to play loud. Music was not loud. That was the only way to play the bass drum. That's how people played the bass drum in 1935. Well, along come the 50s, and in the 50s, electricity kicks in. We find the electric guitar working its way into music. We find the birth of rock and roll, and that comes from rockabilly and blues and jazz all kind of coming together. And with the electric guitar, as many of you may know from playing in rock bands, there's a volume button. And the guitar starts turning up the volume, and the drummers get to play a little bit louder. But it's still pretty simple, pretty laid back, because these people playing that music grew up in the 30s and 40s and only know how to play that way. Now we get into the 60s, and in the 60s the next big thing happens, and that's experimentation in many forms, right? And in the 60s we see swing go away and jazz start. And jazz is no longer dance-based. Jazz is more improvisation-based, and it's more about art. It's more about being expressive and playing music for the sake of music, not for the sake of socialization or dance or cultural events, stuff like that. We also see rock and roll take off in the 60s. And suddenly we get to the 70s, and the rock gets harder and louder. And by the 70s, we see the introduction of the double bass drum setup. Now, it started before that with Louis Bellson, but we really don't see it mainstream until the late 60s, early 70s with some of the rock guys. And we also see PAs grow in size into the 70s. Like, I mean, get big and loud. And the important thing to realize that happens in the 70s is now you have music in two dimensions. You have music for dance and culture and fun, and you have music for the sake of music, art form music. You have bebop happens, jazz happens, fusion happens. The roots of progressive rock start to happen in the 70s, and metal kind of gets its roots in the 70s if you dig deep enough. And with that, the key point is the foot technique changes, because now the drummer has to be louder. And you see guys starting to play a new way on the pedal. They're lifting their heel up and playing with their whole leg, pushing down on the pedal. That's called heel up or leg playing. So by the end of the 70s, we have guys playing two different ways, heel down and heel up. Guys are arguing about which is better. If you're old-fashioned, you're down. If you're new and current, you're up. And it doesn't really matter. Both are good techniques and applicable to playing playing music as a drummer in certain situations. Well, we get to the 80s, and the 80s is when things really start to take off. By the 80s, the pedals have modified quite a bit. We have much nicer pedals, and everything gets big in the 80s. It gets louder, it gets bigger, and out comes, in the 80s, MTV comes out, and the video tape recorder comes out. And all of a sudden, now in the 80s, not only can we hear the music, we can see the music. And that's a huge difference maker, a game changer in the evolution of the drum set. Why do you say? Because in the 70s, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, if I wanted to learn to play a song, I had to put on my record album. By the 70s, most everybody had a record player and a cassette player by the 80s, and even a CD player by the 90s. But you had to listen to music and figure out how to play it. But you couldn't see how somebody was doing something. So if somebody did something with their feet, I couldn't see it. I could only listen to it and then try to figure out how they were doing whatever they were doing. So it left foot technique as a mystery, so to speak. But by the end of the 80s, we had the VHS system. And drummers started putting out instructional video cassettes. And you could buy them and watch them, and they would share with you their techniques. I remember watching Dave Weckels' video in the early 90s, and he talked about not just his hand technique, but his foot technique. And it was fantastic. It just helped point people in a direction on how to use their feet. So another important part of the 80s is as metal starts to take off. As in the 80s you have glam rock, And of course you had Van Halen, and I think Alex has to be mentioned here for Hot for Teacher. What a great double bass drum part on a song that I think inspired many people to change the way they think about the bass drum as an instrument, and to work on foot technique. You know, I remember as a kid thinking, how is he doing that? I've got to figure that out, and I started practicing. But that paved the way for metal. And as we get into the 90s, we still have VHS tapes coming out. MTV's giving us a look at drummers, brief glimpses of the drummer, of course, and you rarely can see the feet. But you're starting to get some momentum in developing foot technique. But in the 90s, grunge happens, and they go back to single bass drum. However, the metal people underneath kept right on going with their speed metal and their thrash metal, and that bass drum and those techniques kept growing. Finally, we get to the 2000s, and along comes YouTube. And hallelujah for YouTube. There are thousands of videos now available on YouTube that are free, where average guys like myself can share with you the techniques they use for their hands and feet in drumming, and all of us can look at it and go, wow, I never knew, or I never thought of that, or I never tried that, and experiment with these new techniques and learn them and grow as drummers with stronger foot technique. So that brings me back to the bass drum. The bass drum started out as a timekeeper, but as the evolution of music and the drum set came along and music became art-driven along with dance-driven, the demand for using the bass drum as an instrument within the drum set became important. And no longer is the whole drum set thought of as just a timekeeping machine, although it is quite often in dance music. It is also thought of as its own individualized instrument within the ensemble, with a variety of parts to it. And now you see great drummers like Thomas Lang and Virgil Donati using their hands and feet together in unison as one instrument to just create these amazing drum parts that go from frequency levels on the bottom to the top with the cymbals. And it's amazing the music they create with the whole ensemble of drums, but it all comes back to technique. And with the evolution of the drum set and music, the techniques of the bass drum and the feet have come a long way in 110 years. I think the guys that invented that early pedal would be shocked to see what that invention turned into today. So all that history, there it is. Welcome aboard. Now you have an understanding of where it came from, and you know where it's going, right? Sky's the limit. If the hands can do it, the feet can do it. That's where it's headed. In my series, I hope to show you the techniques, although I'm not great at all of them. I have my preferred techniques, but I'll show as many of them as I know to you and help point you in the right direction.